Okay, welcome everyone to Design Midlands webinar 2 on your bike. This is the second webinar of 3 that we're running in March. Last week, some of you may have gone to the National Model Design Code session, which was really interesting. This week, we're doing a session called On Your Bike, and next week it's about trees, which will also be really interesting as well. So my name's Emily Walsh. I'm chairing the session today, and we have a lovely panel: Phil Jones, who a lot of you will know, and Katerina Karanga from Savills as well. And the purpose of this session is really to focus on discussing the new approaches that are coming out in guidance in relation to designing for walking and cycling, and what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, how do we convince others, convince people that are designing and managing streets to adopt these new approaches. So just a quick, very, very quick canter through, and I think Phil is going to spend a bit more time on some of these. Gear Change was published last year. It's really bold, and it's really, really clear, I think. I love the key design principles. I think, that's, I've been waving it in front of lots and lots of people that I work with, my clients and my colleagues. There's also then, following on from that, far more detailed advice in the cycle infrastructure design document that was published last year. And there's also new guidance, strengthened guidance in the draft text for consultation in NPPF. And we also have the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code, all of which are talking about active modes and designing for walking and cycling and how we most effectively do that. So I'm not going to spend long talking. I'd like to hand over to Phil, who will now share his screen, and he's got a short presentation. Please keep thinking about questions, post them in the sidebar, and we will come to them after the presentations. Just to say very, very quickly, we're going to run for an hour. So we're going to run from 11:30 to 12:30 today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Emily. I think if you can end the screen share, that's right. Okay, fantastic.
That worked.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get mine to go. So great. That's that. Yeah, does that come up okay? Just a grey screen for the moment.
Yes, all good, Phil, thanks. Great,
there we go. Okay, lovely, bit of a logo. So yeah, thanks Emily. So I'll just talk for maybe 5-10 minutes or try to. Yeah, so we're in, sorry, I'm clicking too many times. Right, let me go back. So yeah, we're in really interesting times. All of these documents, with the exception of Manual for Streets 3, which doesn't exist yet, so that's just a little mock-up. But all of those documents have come out during the pandemic, and I just think the pace of change that is happening at the moment is quite breathtaking, really, and it's quite a difficult result to keep up with. The most recent one is the new bus strategy, which I've not even had time to do more than glance at yesterday, but fundamentally changes the way that buses are funded and operated across England outside London. So quite astonishing. So yeah, Gear Change, cycle infrastructure. I'll say a bit more about those. The Model Design Code and the National Design Guide that preceded that. NPPF, the whole change of the planning system. The review of the highway code. So we are promised quite soon a new highway code, or a revised highway code that will change or strengthen the requirements for drivers to give way, amongst many other things, give way to cyclists and pedestrians, and again have implications for the design of infrastructure. And then the Traffic Management Act, that told local authorities they had to plan for improving conditions for walking and cycling, and then above all of that, the decarbonisation of the transport sector, and we were seeing the latest report on that in the run up to COP26. So yeah, very, very interesting. But just to focus on gear change, which is really what we focus here, and Emily introduced it. I think one or two things that stand out for me, in particular, is the role of Active Travel England. We were just chatting before we started, and I was asked the question, whether any other country actually has a body like this, and I'm not aware of one. The closest I can think of is Sustrans in Scotland, that administers the Scottish government's funding for cycling and walking, and does hold local authorities to account to some degree. But Active Travelling is bigger and bolder than that. And the government is giving themselves some sticks. So schemes will, the presumption that schemes will adhere to the new cycle guidance, or they call them standards actually, in gear change, which we'll come on to, and the funding to be provided to back that up as well. And if local authorities don't adhere to it, then they won't get the money, and that's a big motivation. And so gear change introduces cycle infrastructure design, which myself and my colleague Adrian Lord were involved in, with WSP as well, and closely working with Department of Transport. So really interesting project to do. And I'm pleased to say I think it's been quite well received. And government in gear change said that they really gave a lot of strength to it, and said that again schemes will have to adhere to it to require funding, and they use this word enforced. Enforced, I think, is a very strong language that indicates this is no longer guidance that authorities can pick up if they wish to. It is something that government will be expecting them to work to. It talks about embedding the guidance in local authorities' own standards, and the kind of things that gear change talks about. So physically segregated bike tracks, all the research shows that if we want more people to cycle, and so this is not about designing for cyclists, this is designed for people who would like to cycle but are currently deterred, that the protection from heavy and fast motor vehicles is the key. So this photograph is in London, south of Vauxhall Bridge. There's a kind of infrastructure that's gone in the capital in the last few years. But that's not the only way of designing for cycling. The other way, and this is very good for walking too, is to introduce low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that. And gear change is very, very positive and talks about a community right to close side streets. We haven't heard much more about how that's going to work, but that's going to be very interesting to actually empower local communities to request these changes of their highway authorities. And developments. So another important function of Active Travel England will be a statutory consultee within the planning system. So again, I think all the indications are that LTM 120 is something that the development industry is going to have to pay quite a lot of attention to, and as are local highway authorities and planning authorities. And I'm aware of at least one development that was refused, and in the reason for refusal it cited LTM 120. And did lead to the scheme being changed. And then the other document I want to just talk a little bit about was the National Model Design Code, which again is fairly recent. It's only in draft, but I think the direction of travel is very clear, fitting in with the changes that we're expecting to see to the planning system. And it's just getting much more specific. So one of the criticisms of Manual for Streets, and I think will be addressed in the new edition, or hope it will, is that it wasn't detailed enough. It wasn't firm enough for local highway engineers to really grapple with. The National Model Design Code is providing this detailed guidance and specific detailed parameters that will spell out what is expected as developments come forward. And so we're seeing things like a clear statement about street hierarchies, actually moving away explicitly from the place and movement status that we saw in Manual for Streets, but talking about connected places, talking about a street network, moving away from cul-de-sacs. So we know that cul-de-sacs create places that are not very walkable. So that's important that we see that. It talks about the different functions of streets, though. It is embracing the principles of Manual for Streets, And those public realm functions of streets are contained in another whole section of the National Model Design Code around public space. So it's interesting that the core messages of Manual for Streets are still here, expressed slightly differently, but perhaps given a little more sharpness in the way that the National Model Design Code is written. So it talks about connectivity, talks about, I think so this very simple test actually, each street has more than one connection to another street, and cul-de-sac are only found at the tertiary level. So hopefully, moving away from that sort of tree-like structure that we get so often, that just makes it, creates much places that are much more difficult to serve by public transport and less well connected for walking and cycling. I'm also pleased to see the National Model Design Code picks up on the message of filtered permeability. So one of the criticisms of Manual for Streets was actually it was too pro permeability for all forms of movement. And we've now seen, I think, with places like Waltham Forest, which is the image on the bottom left, of how we can have a connected network, but that connectivity is greatest for the most sustainable and benign modes, if you can call them that. So National Model Design Code puts a lot of emphasis on active travel. It's up there as one of the top line messages in the movement section. And just little details that we can see down here, continuous footway crossings at the mouth of side roads, the kind of thing that Manual for Streets have been talking about for years, but we've not seen very much in practice. And he picks up on the kind of message that we see in Gear Change: continuous, clear, direct, attractive routes, which are very much in line with good practice. Slightly guarded comments though about low traffic neighbourhoods, which is interesting. It talks about them being appropriate, whether this is a reaction to some of the bad press that we've seen. I think unreasonably bad press around low traffic neighbourhoods. We're supported by the local community, but in the context of new development, what community are we talking about, and who should have a veto on that? So, interesting thoughts really there. So that's a very quick introduction from me, and obviously look forward to the chat later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Phil. Katerina, do you want to come in now and share your screen?
Sure. Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Phil. Okay, I'll try and share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Let me see. So is that okay? Can someone just confirm to me, please?
Katerina, we can see that.
Great, perfect. Okay, so my name is Katerina Caraga. I'm an associate at Farrells. Farrells are master planning, urban design and architectural practice, which has been around for almost over 50 years now. So to link, I'll try in my short presentation to link with the amazing presentation Phil gave, and talk a little bit about a couple of different aspects in regards to the radical change we're facing in our towns and cities since the arrival of the mass motorization. So from a point of view of an urban designer and master planner, I'm going to touch on the opportunities, constraints, and what next when it comes to cycling and walking, as well as what are the different technologies we need to be thinking of to even further improve the sustainability credentials. So just to start with, I have included a diagram which I've taken from the Gear Change Bold Vision for Walking and Cycling, which Phil touched on as well. And I thought that this is it clearly shows the great opportunities and benefits of walking and cycling investment in terms of health, well-being, as well as environmental climate change, and reducing congestion, economy, and local businesses. I would like to highlight the statement that transport mode shift is one of the most efficient and cost-effective way of reducing transport emissions and the health benefits that come with it. The vision document further emphasizes the importance of physical activity, supported by the statistic of physical inactivity being responsible for 1 in 6 UK deaths. So cycling is good for your health, is good for the environment, and good for revitalizing the heart of our towns and villages. So to link to this, we have recently looked at how healthy, sustainable, and sustainable are walking, cycling, electric bikes, electric scooters, and cars. And we've produced this diagram, which is on the screen, and we try to explain the relationship between a catchment area for a 15-minute city walk, cycling, or electric scootering, and how that those kind of measures are calculated in regards to calories spent and CO2 emissions. So you can notice that cycling is the most lowest carbon per kilometer modes of transport. It's even better than walking. But obviously these are some complicated ways of measuring carbon emissions, which include manufacturing and food calories needed. So we took the 15 minutes as a reference to support the argument around a 15-minute neighborhood, or sometimes referred as a 15-minute city, which is one of the foundations upon which zero transport networks can be built. This topic, as some of you may know, it's been a hot topic in master planning since the pandemic, and it has been increasingly prominent since the mayor of Paris has announced it as a vision for Paris in 2020. We believe that the 15-minute city can easily be applied to garden communities design with the aim to improve sustainable mobility. So what are the challenges when designing for sustainable garden communities? Self-sustaining developments reduce the need for unnecessary long distance travel, often traveled by car. So therefore, neighborhoods which are more walkable and cyclable have a strong sense of community. They promote health and well-being, and on the long run, they improve the resilience to health emergencies and promote sustainability and livability. The relationship between garden communities and private car ownership is often the result of a limited public transport, a poor quality of public realm, and the lack of provision of walking and cycling routes, as well as a few minutes within a walking and cycling distance. So although the provision of walking and cycling facilities is not really a new concept, they're not always designed effectively. One of the greatest challenges when designing garden communities is it's getting the status of a truly sustainable development, which lies in mobility. So there's a previous research from Transport for New Homes, which was done in 2018, and shows that 20 new garden communities, which were assessed in various stages of the planning process, would create up to 200,000 car-dependent homes. The report also showed the design of the walking and cycling routes was often an afterthought. So I also want to highlight that in areas where highway networks are congested, planning consent will only be achieved with minimal or no highway impact. So the developments that propose high quality, well-connected, sustainable transport options will enable and encourage people to walk and cycle and help to achieve the necessary mode share to gain planning consent. So on the screen, I'm just illustrating some of this principle and actions that we've gathered as part of this study of sustainable communities and how they can be improved. And then to go to the challenges which we see in our towns and cities. During the pandemic, we saw some quick win interventions in our town and cities where bike lanes were becoming the sort of the 24-hour gyms and free and open to everyone. So there was a reduced traffic and sort of that encouraged people to cycle more. So I'm personally a representative of that group that became a passionate cyclist during the pandemic, bought a bike and started cycling more intensively. So there were pop-up cycle lanes implementation on streets. So around 138 schemes have been completed, with 13 having to be scrapped and 25 to be altered after a backlash from residents and statutory groups or emergency services. So some of the schemes have been reported to be riddled with problems, including increased pollution, traffic gridlock, and delaying emergency services vehicles. So often quite controversial. So as an example, the neighborhood I lived in had a similar intervention, which was altered but kept, and I can see that I can clearly see the benefits of it. So as a big supporter of this type of interventions, I believe that we can improve in the way that they are being promoted, in the way we work with the local community, in understanding of what the actual needs are, and have an incremental and planned change. So we're currently working together with PJA actually on a master plan for a city in Yorkshire, where we are looking at a low traffic neighbourhoods and some of and cycle lane and new cycle lanes provision, as well as cycle facilities as part of the vision, which then on a long term, the master plan will support some of the smaller projects, and then it can make a clear path for individual interventions. We're still to go into a more heavy consultation process on this, so results to be seen. And then just kind of to add to that, it's not always only about cycle lanes, obviously. Some of the key challenges are cycle facilities. The gear change document also touches on that, which is great. There's also the emphasis of the need of electric bikes. So some towns and cities, because of topography and the terrain, are not really good for cycling, but we'll need kind of to see the electric bikes come in action. So the gear change vision mentions a national electricity assisted bike support program, which is great. It also touches on the multimodal traveling, super important. So how can we take more bikes on trains and buses? I've included here an interesting image from the Dartford Tunnel Cycle Service, which is a short-lived type of double-decker, which was going across the Dartford Tunnel and taking bikes on one level and cyclists on another. Yeah, so it's about cycling facilities as well as the multimodal traveling. And just to end up on a more sort of blue sky thinking note, so what are the new approaches to cycling? What sort of cycling interventions we can be looking at, and how can we improve the green factor of cycling even more? So this is just some images of an idea called the S-Park from two designers, which was developed around the Clean Energy Challenge for Amsterdam. And it's just an interesting idea where the front wheel of a regular bike can be changed, and this new wheel can store the kinetic energy produced by the circular motion in the batteries. And then when the cyclists return home to their neighborhood or park their bike in a communal bike frame that's connected to the grid, the energy that the batteries have stored can flow into the electrical grid. So the wheel can stay on the bike for a long period, acting just like any other bike wheel. So it's sort of an interesting concept. I thought in terms of further emphasizing the reduction of carbon emissions, even with cycling. So thank you all for following. That would be my short presentation. Get back on the screen.
I'll unmute before I start talking. It always helps. Thanks ever so much. Although some people are very glad when I don't unmute, I'll be honest. Thanks very much, Phil and Katerina. Lots to think about there. There are a number of if I could ask people to put any questions that they have in the Q&A, and then we can discuss them. I mean, there's a couple of questions in there already. I don't know if Katerina and Phil have had a chance to have a look at those. I think one of the one that I'd like to start with, if possible, is the one from Amrit, which asks, how can cycling possibly be more sustainable than walking in terms of CO2? So he's asking what factors were informed the CO2 measure from walking, because when Katerina showed asked that yesterday. That was my immediate thought, and I didn't get around to asking it. So Katerina, can you shed any light on that?
But yes, of course. When we were doing the research, we were also super surprised by that. I think there's there are a lot of studies that we were sort of relying on, and maybe I should have included that link of a study that we looked at to take the numbers. We're obviously not doing those calculations ourselves, but as I said, it's a combination of and the fact that the carbon emission include manufacturing and food and calories needed. So that's in sort of saying that the food and calories needed for people to walk, as well as probably the cost of trainers, super expensive Nikes. I don't know. So there's some logic between that, but yeah, it's an interesting number actually.
I think it's energy efficiency, isn't it? Isn't it that a cycle transforms us from an ape into a cheetah or something like that? You know, in terms of the speed, the speed that we can go. So yeah.
No, that's really interesting actually, and I mean a lot of towns and cities are declaring climate emergencies and having targets to reduce CO2. So that's a really interesting angle on that. I think there's also a number of questions. So Richard Shaw, if we go right back to the beginning, he's I think, Richard, you're asking about a development that is in process. I don't know if it's built yet. It'd be helpful to know if it's something that's actually been built, or whether it's just master planned and designed. And no one's proposing to change the design. So he's asking what to do, really. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, other than to say, you know, if something hasn't, I would say if something hasn't been built, then there's an opportunity to change it. But Phil and Katerina, I'm sure you've got some observations on that question.
I mean, just to pick on the Richard's question, that 4,000 houses cycling should be on the highway. That clearly wouldn't be wouldn't be in accordance with LTM 120. I mean, I could just very quickly just show it. I mean, I'm not going back to a big presentation, but if I could just very quickly show, if I can work the magic, a diagram from LTM 120, which is quite significant, I think, which is a table 4.1. So I get all techie. Table 4.1. And we spent quite a bit of time thinking about this this particular chart, and you know, lots of cycle design guides have got something like this in them, which talks about, you know, when is it appropriate to segregate. Sorry, this is I think, has that come up yet?
That's on screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't put it in presenter mode, but yeah. So this is the absolutely key chart from LTM 120, and when we did this, so lots of other design guides of this type, you've got a graph maybe, or with a line on it, and it, you know, above the line it says you should segregate, and below the line it says you should integrate. And actually we took a decision not to do that, not to kind of tell people what to do, but to say what are the implications of the different design choices. So if you've got it, so if the top left-hand corner here, if you've got a street with 20 miles an hour and very little traffic, there's no reason you can't do a fully curb protected cycle track. You know, if you want to, if you've got the space, and say that route goes to a primary school or whatever, you can do that. And if you do that, then you will end up with something that's suitable for most people. Now, obviously, that means that because you're not mixing with the traffic at all, that's green all the way down to 50 miles an hour plus, you know. And so this is, and so, you know, your 4,000 home principal street, I'm sure would be probably somewhere over here, wouldn't it? 30 miles an hour with lots of vehicles, and, you know, just said it would be suitable for few people and would exclude most potential users. So that's the consequence of that sort of design choice, really. So yeah.
I mean, it's also a choice about speed limits as well. So I mean, that's one of the changes that people can make. But I mean, that diagram, we've been showing that to lots of people as well. I mean, it seems absolutely fundamental, you know, in terms of planning planning for cycling streets. Katerina, do you want to add to that in terms of any commentary? We've got a lot of questions coming in now, so I don't know if there's another.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, I think that sort of covers, that's well answered from Phil, so nothing to add from me. Let's go on, maybe on another question. I'm trying to look forwards.
I was going to pick up one from Jonathan Sankville, actually, about retrofitting existing neighbourhoods and with new cycling policy requirements. I mean, it is a big challenge, isn't it? So I don't know if you've got any. I mean, that is such a huge question, really. How easy do you think it will be? I mean, hopefully it will keep all of us in work for the next, next forever. But I mean, do you want to make any commentary on that? Is there anything that you?
Yeah, I would just say that some of the examples, as I said, with the pop-up cycling lanes showed us how controversial they might be, but still, sort of the numbers from 134 schemes where we have almost 2/3 or more that were sort of that survived. I think it's a pretty good number. So we'll probably need to look at kind of lessons learned from there and how can we do better. But as I said, I think it's super important for the local communities to be brought in the conversation to understand where and how this improvements can be beneficial. Because as we always know, not all sort of it's not all skills fits all. So yeah, that would be my response.
I think that's right. I think that was one of the problems with the emergency. I can understand why government felt they had to do it quickly. It was the pandemic, and well, we're still in it, I know, and they felt they had to act quickly. But what it meant was that there wasn't time to engage with local people, and there was some backlash. Having said that, I know DFT did release some survey data recently that showed these schemes are generally popular. And actually, it's very easy to people who oppose things are always more vociferous than people who support. Yeah. So you get the impression from the media that these things are terribly unpopular. In fact, most people do support them. The only thing I'd just very quickly say is that whole low traffic neighbourhood approach, though, does depend on there being a connected network of streets to filter. And in many post-war areas of development, there are no other routes apart from the cul-de-sac, so there's nothing to filter. It's already filtered for everybody, but it's not filtered. It's impermeable for everybody. So in kind of DB32 land, it's about how do you create walking and cycling routes that maybe don't exist, rather than filtering out car traffic. So, I think it depends on the structure of your local network or how easy it physically is to do that.
That's a really huge issue, isn't it, in some areas, and the radical nature of intervening to create additional links is something that's rarely thought about for walking and cycling. And we build new links from a highway vehicle perspective, but from a walking cycling perspective, it seems to be something that doesn't crop up, and maybe that's something that needs to be thought about in some areas. I just wanted to.
You did that in Solihull, didn't you, Emily?
What was that? Oh yes, we did. That's true. Quite radical, actually. Quietly radical. Yeah, because new links were put in, and they unpicked the Radburn layout quite drastically in North Solihull, but it was very incremental and required wide-scale master planning and a lot of engagement and developer input. So it was hard to do. But yes, absolutely. Wilf Tomini is asking a really interesting question, I think, about the role of Active Travel England, which we've touched on, but it does seem like a huge opportunity. And Wilf's really asking about how you get highway authorities who maybe in some areas of the country aren't that concerned about missing out on certain sorts of funding, And he's asking about if funding is the carrot, is there a stick that can be used to force compliance with the new guidance about cycle infrastructure design in particular? And additionally, if Active Travel England are a consultee, do they have an ability to engage with the Highway Authority on projects to ensure they address active travel concerns? So it's really about the role of, you know, the potential role of Active Travel England. So I don't know, Katerina and Phil, whether you can expand on that for Wilf.
I mean, as far as I know, we haven't had an announcement on Active Travel England yet in detail, although I have been part of some discussions with DfT. I mean, I think that funding is the stick and the carrot, and I think what they're saying is it's not just funding for new cycle schemes; it's all highway funding, and if it is to be believed, Active Travelling will not just inspect cycling and walking schemes; they will look at everything that highway authorities do, and saying are they complying with this guidance, and that will affect all levels of highway funding. So it's quite a big stick that they are wielding. So. Yeah, you know, it just remains to be seen whether that will actually play out, because there will be some political backlash, I'm sure, from some authorities against that.
Katerina, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that at all, or whether Hannah Coupland has.
Yeah, I would just say yes. I think there's quite a big focus on the compliance, so that that will definitely be the sort of a way of, and then compliance in different stages on the project actually. So the way that they're planning to release the funds, etc. I think it's all kind of well covered in the gear change document of how they're going to implement that.
It's just quite interesting because it still feels like in a lot of places there's still a big cultural shift needed, you know. And I mean, you know, it's you know, this is all there, but how is that cultural shift and that mindset changed, you know, because it does feel very much like a mindset still. You know, these pieces of guidance are brilliant and clear, and you know, there's so much that's good about them, but there's still this sort of mindset, it feels like that we, you know, we need to make sure cars are all right and then we'll fit everything else in. But you know, no, it is gradually changing. I wonder whether Hannah Coupland's got a lovely question actually, which you know, is important, I think, in terms of planning you know, active travel infrastructure, certainly in towns and cities and built up areas. And she's wondering about the role that green infrastructure plays. And I'm assuming by green infrastructure, she means parks and open spaces, but also green infrastructure in streets as well. Hannah, if I've got that wrong, correct me, but Phil and Katerina, you know, have you got any observations on that? On the role of green infrastructure.
Which do you want to take that on?
Sorry, Phil, I didn't.
Yeah, no, you carry on.
No, so yeah, I mean, definitely when we talk about sort of healthy living and cycling and walking, green infrastructure is definitely an inseparable part of it. And another sort of lesson we've learned from the pandemic is we understood how important our local parks, our sort of green areas and green spaces in our towns and cities are important to keep us during social distancing and sort of help us with the mental health and everything included. So yes, it's all connected. That is definitely super important, and it definitely helps helps the vision. And I know sort of reading the gear change document, it talks, even if it's called the bold vision for cycling and walking, and mainly talks about cycling in reality, but if we kind of touch on the walking aspect a bit more, I think there's also the safety aspect, which again we're becoming more aware of. So the safe walking routes and sort of feeling safe, it will be important. So to think like proposals where natural surveillance is emphasized in sort of developments, I think are also super important. So yeah, it's all connected, but definitely green infrastructure a big role in the whole kind of network of things.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I mean,
Sorry, absolutely. I think it's quite. I think in the past it's been wrong. You know, people have been thinking about walking and cycling through green spaces as leisure routes, but they can be just as good as it can be. You know, directly get you to employment or to. But as Katrina says, you know, you have to feel secure, particularly. You know, we unfortunately, you know, with women feeling less safe than they should, and the need for lighting, which is really, really important. So these are usable right through the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, that issue about, you know, what's our base standard. You know, is it just that we feel safe and secure, or is it that it's enjoyable as well? Because you know, what should we be doing? I mean, obviously there is at an absolute minimum, walking, cycling needs to feel safe and secure, doesn't it? At its absolute minimum, but it often feels like we need to go that extra step to encourage people to walk and cycle it, as opposed to get into their car. And I mean, maybe that's something that we're missing. I mean, certainly some of the better designed schemes seem to, you know, introduce enjoyment as well with walking and cycling, don't they? And green infrastructure has a huge part to play in that. So I just wonder if there's any, Katerina or Phil, have any observations on that issue about function versus enjoyment as well for planning and cycling.
No. I think it's right. I mean, you know, it's not just about functionalities, that we want to enjoy the journey as well. So I think that's right. I mean, in one of the key sort of underpinnings of LTM 120, as it was in the old document, there are five principles or five attributes of good cycling routes, which is safe and safety, but also coherence. You understand where it goes, directness, and comfort, and attractiveness. And attractiveness, sometimes we kind of think that's a nice to have, but you know, it's very often, it's not at all unusual for people to say, well, I would much rather go this way than this way, because it is much more attractive. Because we have five senses, and when you're walking and cycling, you're kind of using all of them, aren't you? So I think that's really, really important.
I'm going to drop onto a question from Graham Smith, who most of us know, and he's talking about the major issue of busy streets needs to be addressed more intensively. And I think Graham's wondering what impact the current guidance has on, you know, the design of these busy streets. You know, what would a cross section look like? Will the service road make a reappearance? I mean, there's clearly some big implications for street design in the new guidance. So I just wondered whether Phil and Katerina want to comment on the implications for different types of streets.
I mean, it might. I'll just very quickly, and then it'd be interesting to see what Katerina thinks. I mean, I think it might mean that we do end up with wider streets, wider corridors. I saw I was on a design review the other day, and I saw a scheme for a new kind of principal street through a big development in Cornwall, and it'd been designed with a two-way cycle track and a verge and a carriageway and footway, and it was wide. It was much wider than we used to, but it was doing the job. So what are the implications on that, on density and so on? So yeah, I mean, from a master plan point of view, I don't know what Katerina you might feel about that.
Yes, I would say. However, there's always sort of from a design point of view, we always sort of think about the human scale, and how sort of one will feel on a super wide road with a lot of sort of different segregated lanes. I suppose there's a balance between the two. There's always sort of the question of good design, which Phil, you and your colleagues and Emily probably know more better than me, when it comes to how you rationalize sort of and declutter the streets and sort of have innovative thinking about where loading bays can go and how that can be sort of sorted together with some greening on the streets and segregated lanes and whatnot. But yes, I would say the right balance is probably the answer to this. Again, every different problem has its own solution.
Just moving on in terms of questions, Warren Lever is I think going back to a similar theme that we're talking about really. So he's saying we're still seeing many new developments still using cul-de-sacs. I mean, it'd be interesting to know how, and he's talking about limited or poor active travel links, and this seems to be hard baked out into the layouts of many schemes. How will this new guidance be cut through to make a change? I mean, I think ultimately it'll be about things being refused, you know, through the planning process. But you know, Phil and Katerina, have you got any comments on that? I mean, developers are very hard to shift in terms of changing, you know, what they do, you know, and street layouts still look, a lot of them, similar to they did pre-MFS in some respects. But I wonder whether, you know, Active Travel England might have a role in this. Maybe that will radically change things. But Phil and Katerina, what do you think?
I think possibly Active Travel, and then you know, I quickly flash through some of the principles in the National Model Design Code. I mean, you know, again, if the government is to be believed, there won't be planning consent anymore in a few years' time. It'll all be on code. So these decisions about street patterns and connectivity will all be taken when the site is allocated and the design code is produced. So that's where the game is going to be at, I think, in future. So I don't know. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of that plays out. There are so many pieces of the jigsaw that are changing at the moment.
But is that, sorry if I'm misunderstanding, but will people have to follow the design code to have deemed planning consent, do you think? I mean, is that the route that if they...
Yeah, so and if they can demonstrate they follow the design code, when there is no planning consent, it is a purely mechanistic, you know, here is our plans and they meet the criteria that's laid out in the design code, therefore we can go ahead and build. That's it. You know, so getting those requirements for connectivity into the design code will be absolutely fundamental if that's going to be the system we follow.
And I guess one of the things then is that diagram you showed us, Phil, from LTN 20 is it's going to be fundamental to embed that and that approach to street design in the design codes, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
So I think we're moving, you know, I mean, Manning for Streets was an attempt to kind of, to try and inject some urban design thinking into engineers, and maybe it failed. and actually, you know, because the system works on certainty and parameters, and I think maybe that's what we're kind of catching up with now, is that, okay, well, that's what we have to do, is to just make it much more clear, you know, this is what you will do, and then you can get ahead and build. But it is a different, it's a different world.
Yes, I mean, do you think that the difficulty of getting local authorities to in some circumstances, not all, I'm not wishing to, you know, tar all local authorities with the same brush at all, but do you think the organisation, the way that local authorities are structured in terms of, you know, a planning function and a highway function quite often in different places, but also, you know, the way that highway authorities are structured as well, do you think that impacts on the difficulties of delivery, because it does feel like it might still in quite a major way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole question of two-tier local authority doesn't help. You know, just the huge geographical size of some of the highway authorities. You know, those decisions and what people know best about these very short trips and local infrastructure, it's almost kind of under the radar of what counties are to deal with. It's too fine grained, you know. So yeah, there is a structural problem there, but yeah, that's maybe a bigger question.
Okay, I've got a question that that I have that I wonder if Katerina can start with. I just want to note before I do that Becky Meluish, I hope I've got the pronunciation of your surname correct, Becky, is interested in knowing the details of the planning application which was refused for not aligning with LTN 120. So I don't know if it's possible to to pop an answer to that, Phil, in the
it was in Cambridge. It was in it was a it was a development just outside Cambridge Station, and yeah, at the last minute it was refused. So I'll try and find the link and put it in the chat.
Thanks very much. I have a question about micromobility and how you know, does LTN 20 adequately address the challenges that will come with a wider range of micromobility modes, if that's the right word? So, you know, we've got cycling, but, you know, how do we also accommodate scooters, different sorts of cycles? You know, is that adequately covered by LTN 120, or do you think as micromobility develops and grows, which it feels like it inevitably will, there will be need to be further working of that? I don't know, Katerina, if you've got any thoughts on how we design for micromobility as well. Are we just end up with even wider streets? You know, I mean, it sort of seems endless, but what do you think?
Yeah, I would like to actually hear the answer from Phil on that one, but my current response will be, I'm a bit confused, to be honest. I'm also confused as sort of what's allowed, what's not allowed often, but yes, and there's sort of types of transport modes that are still evolving. So yes, I think we still have to see more happening on that aspect of things. Phil, what's your thinking?
I think I mean I think for me it's about thinking just about the speed and the mass.
Yeah.
And we try and group people together that are about the same. Yeah. And that's fundamentally why I think now we've all recognised that mixing pedestrians and cyclists is not a particularly good idea. Yeah. Because they're just moving so much more quickly, and if someone on a micro scooter is going about the same speed as a person on a bike and about the same mass, then they should be in with a cyclist. I think that's, you know, but of course we don't have that infrastructure everywhere. But yeah, for me that's a kind of principle we should be moving to, is trying to, you know, and as you said, Emily, and if you can't find a space to segregate, then you slow things down so that you reduce that differential of speed and mass. It's about the energy that is embodied in the moving person, really, or moving vehicle.
Yeah, I think it feels like quite a big challenge, that in some ways, because it feels like micromobility is a huge opportunity, you know, and scooters can appeal to lots of people, you know, and there are probably other things as well that we haven't thought of, but it almost, that thinking about speed and mass fill needs to be, you know, embedded now in what we're doing, you know, and clear now in the guidance that we have, maybe, you know, as because these things may develop quite quickly. I'm just going back to, we've got a few more minutes. I don't know if anyone's got, so we've got about 5 more minutes. I don't know if Phil and Katerina want to make any sort of final comments and observations, you know, maybe around, you know, what are our biggest challenges? And that's a huge question. And you know, what are the you know, what are our biggest challenges going forward now? Maybe, you know, a sort of short answer as to, you know, one step we could take to address that. So I don't know, Phil or Katerina, whether you want to start with that. Big question, a bit unfair, really. But
well, I think, Emily, I would sort of link to what you said during sort of the panel conversation, is that behavioral change is super important. in everything that's sort of going to come forward. And it is a big shift from an era of motorization into going into more sustainable transport modes. And yes, we'll see where we get to and how things develop. That would be my sort of take.
I think that's right. I think we kind of know what we need. We know what works now. I think we've seen in the last 10 years schemes in London and other cities that have led to a big increase in cycling and walking in some cases where low traffic neighborhoods have happened, and they've actually had more benefit for walking than cycling. So we know what works. The problem is the acceptability of that amongst public and politicians, I think. So that's how that's the crack that we have to crack, I think, is just demonstrating that it works and getting people to understand the benefits, I think. I just Graham, I just will respond to my comment about density. I think you're right. I mean, the way to win back that density about the wider street, the principal street, is to then think about all the other streets that come off that and the buildings. I'm not saying that it will lead to lower densities. I'm just saying that could be an effect. So we have to take that into account within. I'm not saying it isn't the right thing to do. It's just obviously if the street is wider, the street is wider, but we have to then think about how we win that back on the wider master plan, I think.
It's about the design of whole neighbourhoods, isn't it? And designing good density, I suppose, just picking up on that. Interesting. I'm just looking at the time. I think unless anybody, let me just see. Final question actually from Jamie Mattock. Examples. So maybe we'll just run through some quick examples that people may be able to look at on Google Earth, or they may not be on there yet. But are there any examples of the successful LTN application of LTN to existing highway networks? I think most highway networks are constrained, to be completely honest, but I mean specifically constrained highway networks. I.e. where a development is proposed that internally complies with LTN, but connectivity to off-site location due to constraints cannot be provided. I mean, I think that's a very specific thing. I just wondered whether Katerina and Phil could quickly identify a couple of locations or schemes that in the UK that have are successful in terms of their application of the current principles of LTN 120, one or two maybe, just that people can go away and have a look at. Phil, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think one of the best ones that covers both the low traffic neighbourhoods and the cycle infrastructure on busy streets is what was done in Waltham Forest. The in Waltham Forest, and it's been in there for a few years, and there's been a lot of research. If you go to the Active Travel Academy, if you Google that, which is an academic body or associated with the University of Westminster, and they've done some really good research on Waltham Forest. But not only is it the low traffic neighbourhood, they've put in decent cycle facilities on busy routes as well.
Yeah.
And they've taken the hard steps of removing car parking. Sometimes the thing that's holding us back is removing that car parking, and maybe that's what has to go. And that's a tough thing to ask, but yeah.
That's a tough one, the car parking one, isn't it? We're facing that on. We're looking at the moment, very difficult. Katerina, just a final, do you have any schemes that you love and you think?
Yeah, not on the top of my mind. Actually, I was thinking about Waltham Forest as well because I saw it in Phil's presentation. But I'll probably need to think harder on that.
That's okay, sorry. Okay, well, finishing on Waltham Forest is something we can all go away and look at as a scheme, but also in terms of including research that demonstrates its impact. I think is a really useful place to finish. Thank you very much to Phil and Katerina for being on the panel today. It's been really, really interesting, actually. It's been lovely to hear you speak and to have the discussion that we've had, and thank you very much to those people that have joined the session today, and for the interesting questions that we've had. I don't know if Julie wants to say a quick wrap-up word about the webinar next week. Julie, do you want to come in or not? Yes.
Hi, everybody. I don't often hear these things, but yeah, thanks to everybody and to all the questions. Absolutely fascinating, the discussion that we've had. Yes, our next webinar is next week. It's on trees, trees in places and in streets. So we're going to be talking about streets again at the next webinar, but touching on landscape and ecology and everything else. So should be really interesting. So please do register online. It's important you do register, because if you can't make it, we'll send you an email afterwards with the recording link as well. So it's useful to register, even if you feel you can't make it.
Okay, thanks very much. Should we leave it there?